A night of glamour and shadows. The entrance to the Starlight Grand Hotel gleamed under the cascading glow of golden chandeliers, a beacon of prestige and luxury in the heart of Los Angeles. The Celestial Charity Gala, an event reserved for Hollywood's elite, promised an evening of elegance, philanthropy, and, of course, the glitz of red carpet spectacle. Keanu Reeves, clad in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, stepped out of his sleek, understated car. The flash of cameras greeted him instantly. His face remained calm, composed, a mix of quiet humility and the air of a man accustomed to the public eye, but never fully comfortable in it. As he made his way down the carpet, the crowd erupted with cheers. Fans chanted his name, holding out posters, memorabilia, and cameras, eager for a moment of his time. Keanu took a deep breath, offering polite smiles, nods, and occasional waves. The chaotic energy of the press and the enthusiasm of his supporters created a strange contrast to his naturally reserved demeanor. Inside the grand atrium, the ambience shifted from the electric energy of flashing cameras to a refined, almost surreal sophistication. The gilded marble floors, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the brilliance of the crystal chandeliers above. A soft melody of live orchestral music hummed through the air, blending seamlessly with the sound of light laughter, clinking champagne glasses, and hushed whispers of the Hollywood elite. Keanu's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the extravagant displays of wealth, the million-dollar necklaces, custom-designed gowns, and the subtle but deliberate air of superiority that lingered around certain guests. Yet, beyond the surface, he had learned long ago that these gatherings weren't just about charity or goodwill. Power moved in the shadows here. Deals were struck behind closed doors. Alliances formed over whispered conversations. A staff member, dressed in a crisp, white uniform, approached him with a respectful nod. "Good evening, Mr. Reeves. Would you care for a drink?" Keanu offered a small, polite smile. "Whiskey. Neat." The staffer nodded, swiftly returning with a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. Keanu took the drink, feeling the smooth warmth slide down his throat as he observed the guests mingling. His solitude was short-lived. From across the ballroom, a man approached, a tall, well-groomed individual in an expensive charcoal gray suit. He carried himself with a confidence bordering on arrogance, his movements deliberate, calculated. Keanu instantly recognized Victor Lancome, a name that had been whispered frequently among Hollywood circles in recent years. Victor was a renowned event organizer, a man who had risen to prominence through a mix of undeniable talent, high-profile connections, and an uncanny ability to charm the most powerful people in the industry. He was known for orchestrating the grandest galas, charity events, and elite social gatherings. His reputation, impeccable. Yet, something about his presence felt off. Victor's smile was practiced, the kind that barely reached his eyes as he extended a firm hand. "Keanu Reeves," he greeted smoothly, his tone drenched in feigned warmth. "An absolute pleasure. I've been hoping to meet you for quite some time." Keanu took the offered hand, his own grip firm but neutral. "Likewise," he replied simply. Victor gestured to the young girl standing beside him, a petite, wide-eyed child of about 10 years old, dressed in a simple denim jacket and jeans, a stark contrast to the extravagant attire around them. "This is my daughter, Sophie," Victor introduced, resting a possessive hand on her small shoulder. "She's been eager to meet you." The girl, clearly in awe, hesitated before finally whispering, "You're Keanu Reeves." Keanu's usual stoic demeanor softened. He crouched slightly to her eye level, offering her a warm smile. "That's me," he said gently. "And you are?" "I'm Sophie." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's nice to meet you, Sophie," he said, extending a hand for a friendly shake. Sophie hesitated but eventually placed her small hand in his. Her grip was delicate, but there was something unusual about it. Something about the way her fingers trembled slightly against his own. Before she could say more, Victor quickly interjected with an exaggerated chuckle. "She's a little shy," he said, squeezing her shoulder. "She just loves your movies." Keanu's sharp instincts picked up on the way Sophie's shoulders tensed slightly under her father's grip. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it didn't escape his notice. Still, he played along. "Do you have a favorite?" he asked her kindly. Before Sophie could answer, Victor's fingers tightened just slightly on her shoulder, a warning. Her enthusiasm dimmed almost instantly. John Wick," she mumbled. Victor let out a hearty laugh. "She has good taste, doesn't she?" Keanu felt something stir inside him, an uneasy suspicion. The moment was interrupted as Victor eagerly pulled out his phone, positioning them for a quick photo. Keanu obliged, his focus still lingering on Sophie, whose earlier excitement had noticeably dulled. "Just a quick video for my followers," Victor suggested. Keanu gave a small nod, allowing Victor to record a short clip where he waved alongside Sophie. But the moment Victor lowered the phone, his demeanor shifted subtly. "All right, sweetheart," Victor said in a suddenly more rigid tone, his fingers digging slightly into her shoulder. "It's time to go back to the kids' area." Sophie's smile vanished. Her lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but she hesitated. Keanu noticed the brief flicker of fear in her eyes before she obediently nodded. "Of course, Mr. Reeves, we mustn't keep you," Victor said smoothly, his grip on Sophie's arm still firm as he began leading her away. Keanu's gaze followed them as they walked across the ballroom. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. His years in Hollywood had taught him to read people, the facades, the hidden truths, the carefully curated smiles that masked things far darker. And in that moment, as he watched Victor guide Sophie toward a side exit, his gut told him that he had just witnessed a carefully controlled performance, and that Sophie didn't want to leave. As Victor disappeared with his daughter through the side door, Keanu's fingers subconsciously tightened around his whiskey glass. Something about Victor Langham wasn't right. And Sophie, she had tried to say something, but she had been too afraid. Whispers in the shadows. The gala carried on in full splendor. Champagne glasses clinked in toasts, violins hummed through the air, and elite guests exchanged hushed conversations behind polite smiles. Yet, for Keanu Reeves, the glamour of the evening had lost its luster. Standing in a quiet corner of the ballroom, his sharp eyes remained locked on the door where Victor Langham had just taken his daughter, Sophie. The moment lingered in his mind. The way Sophie had tensed under her father's grip, the hesitation in her voice, the pleading look in her eyes before Victor led her away. It wasn't the behavior of a child simply being guided by a parent. It was submission, compliance, fear. Keanu took a slow sip of his whiskey, the warmth doing little to dispel the unease crawling up his spine. His instincts, honed from years of navigating the darker side of Hollywood, were ringing alarm bells. Something was wrong, and he needed to find out what. A stranger's warning. As he placed his empty glass on a passing waiter's tray, a voice cut through the soft murmur of conversation behind him. "You saw it, didn't you?" Keanu turned. A woman stood near him, watching him carefully. She was in her early 40s, with dark eyes that carried a quiet intensity. Her long, wavy chestnut hair framed a sharp, elegant face, and her emerald green gown, though stunning, was slightly out of place among the extravagance of the gala. "Excuse me," Keanu asked, keeping his expression neutral. The woman took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You saw how she looked at you, how he controlled her." Keanu narrowed his eyes. His silence invited her to continue. "You don't know me," the woman said softly, "but I know who you are, and I know what you stand for." She exhaled, "Which is why I'm risking telling you this." Keanu's gaze flickered to the guests around them. No one seemed to notice their conversation. He looked back at the woman. "Who are you?" She hesitated before answering. "Elena Moreau," she said finally. "Investigative journalist. Or at least I was." The name was familiar. Elena Moreau had once been a respected journalist before suddenly disappearing from the public eye. Rumors swirled about legal threats, intimidation, and powerful enemies who wanted her silenced. Keanu's interest deepened. "What do you know about Victor Langham?" Her eyes darkened. "Enough to know that his public image is a lie," Elena murmured, "and that his daughter is in serious danger." Keanu's jaw tensed. "I knew there was something off about him," he admitted, "but I don't have proof." Elena glanced around, then leaned in. "He has connections, Mr. Reeves. High-profile connections. He's careful, very careful. But there are whispers." Her voice dropped lower. "And I believe his wife is being kept against her will." Keanu felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "She hasn't been seen in public for months," she said. "Not willingly, at least. Every event, every appearance, it's been carefully orchestrated. I have sources, people who worked in his estate. They said she's a prisoner in her own home." Keanu exhaled sharply. "And Sophie?" Elena swallowed. "The child has bruises, Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice tight. "More than one person has noticed. But no one is willing to say anything, because Victor controls everything." Keanu clenched his fists. "And what about the police?" Elena gave a bitter laugh. "Victor's money keeps him untouchable. He donates millions to charity, throws lavish galas like this, and makes sure his public reputation is spotless. The authorities aren't going to touch him without concrete evidence." Keanu's thoughts raced. The bruises on Sophie's arms, the way she had clung to him, her plea, "Mr. Reeves, can you protect me?" He knew now he couldn't just walk away. "Where is she now?" Keanu asked. Elena exhaled. "The staff corridored," she said. "I heard him say he was sending her to the children's lounge. But there's something else." She hesitated, then added, "He has private rooms reserved for his guests. Rooms where staff aren't allowed." Keanu's eyes darkened. "Do you think his wife is here tonight?" Elena nodded. "I'd bet my life on it." The decision. Keanu glanced toward the grand staircase leading to the upper floors. If Victor had truly been keeping his wife hidden, if he was abusing Sophie, then this wasn't just a bad parenting situation. This was a crime. Keanu wasn't a cop. He wasn't an investigator. But he was someone who didn't turn his back on people who needed help. He looked back at Elena. "Can you get me into those private rooms?" She hesitated. "I don't have access, but I know someone who does. A staffer. A maid who works for Victor." Keanu nodded. "Then let's move." As they slipped into the quieter section of the hotel, Keanu knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Victor Langham get away with this. Not tonight. Not ever. The hidden doors of the Starlight Grand. Keanu Reeves moved through the opulent Starlight Grand Hotel with measured precision, his tuxedo blending into the sea of luxury, but his mind was elsewhere, locked onto a mission far removed from the glitz of the gala. Beside him, Elena Moreau, the former investigative journalist, walked with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years uncovering the secrets of the elite. Though she maintained an air of casual detachment, Keanu could sense the tension in her posture. "You're sure we can trust this staff member?" Keanu murmured as they weaved through the back corridors leading away from the grand ballroom. Elena shot him a sidelong glance. "No," she admitted, "but I don't have a choice. Neither do you." They reached a service elevator, a polished brass structure tucked away in the shadows of the hotel's grand architecture. It was meant for staff use, hidden from the eyes of the glamorous guests. Elena pressed the call button. Keanu's instincts were on high alert. Every second they spent away from the main event risked drawing attention, but his mind kept circling back to one image. Sophie's bruised arms, the way she had clung to him, the fear in her eyes. The elevator chimed open. Inside stood a young woman in a hotel uniform, her posture stiff with anxiety. She was petite, her blonde hair tied in a neat bun, her eyes darting between Keanu and Elena. "You're late," she hissed at Elena, stepping aside to let them in. Keanu entered without hesitation, noting the staff access badge clipped to her uniform. The elevator doors slid shut with a quiet finality. "I'm Nadia," the maid said in a low voice, "and I shouldn't be doing this." Keanu studied her. She looked over her shoulder before she spoke, the reflex of someone used to living in fear. "You work for Victor?" he asked. She let out a bitter chuckle. "I clean his messes, in more ways than one." Keanu and Elena exchanged a glance. "What do you know?" Keanu asked. Nadia hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a keycard. She held it out to Keanu, her fingers trembling slightly. "This opens room 911 on the upper level. It's one of his private suites, and it's where his wife is." Elena sucked in a sharp breath. "He's keeping her here, at the hotel." Nadia nodded. "Not willingly. She was brought in through the service entrance hours ago. I saw it myself." Keanu felt his jaw tighten. "That bastard." "Where's Sophie?" he asked. Nadia's face fell. "In the children's lounge, but I heard him give orders to a security guard to handle her if she ran away again." Keanu's hands curled into fists. Elena exhaled. "We don't have much time." The elevator dinged softly as it arrived on the restricted floor. Keanu took the keycard from Nadia. "Stay here," he told her. "If something goes wrong, we'll need someone who can still move freely." Nadia looked relieved. "Be careful," she whispered. The doors slid open. Keanu and Elena stepped into the unknown. The room of secrets. The restricted floor was eerily silent, far removed from the lively gala below. Plush carpeting absorbed their footsteps as Keanu led the way toward room 911. No security guards patrolled the hallway, which wasn't a good sign. "This feels too easy," Elena whispered. Keanu agreed. He had spent enough time in Hollywood to know that the worst predators wore the most expensive suits. Reaching the door, Keanu swiped the keycard. Click. The lock released. Keanu pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was large, too large for a simple guest suite. The lights were dim, casting long, eerie shadows over the expensive furniture and dark velvet curtains. A scent of expensive perfume and something bitter lingered in the air. And then he saw her, Barbara Langham. She was sitting on a velvet couch by the window, her elegant dress wrinkled, her makeup smudged. Her dark hair had been styled to perfection earlier in the night, but now it was loose, messy, like she had been pulling at it in frustration. She looked up at the sound of their footsteps. Her eyes widened in shock. "Whoa," she started, but then her gaze landed on Keanu. A breath hitched in her throat. "Mr. Reeves," she whispered. Keanu took a step closer. "We don't have much time," he said quietly. "We need to get you out of here." Barbara's hands clenched in her lap. She faltered. Elena spoke gently. "We know what's happening, Barbara. We know about Sophie. The bruises. The fear. We know what Victor has been doing to both of you." Barbara's eyes shimmered with unused tears. I tried," she whispered, her voice raw with exhaustion. But no one listened. Keanu knelt beside her, his voice steady, calm but firm. "I'm listening now." Barbara's lips parted, as if she wanted to believe him but didn't dare hope. "He'll kill me," she choked out. "If I leave." He swore he would. And Sophie." Keanu reached out slowly, resting a hand on her trembling ones. "Sophie ran to me," he said. "She asked me to protect her." Barbara let out a shaky breath. Something inside her seemed to snap. Years of fear, of silence, of enduring an invisible prison. Her fingers tightened around his. "I won't leave without my daughter." Keanu nodded. "Then let's get her." The breaking point. They moved quickly. Keanu, Elena, and Barbara retraced their steps, hurrying toward the service elevator. But as they turned the corner, they stopped dead in their tracks. Victor Langham stood at the far end of the hallway. He wasn't alone. 2 private security guards flanked him. And in his grip, Sophie. She was crying silently, her face pale, her arms locked in her father's bruising grip. Victor's eyes burned with fury as he took in the sight of Keanu holding his wife's hand. "What do you think you're doing?" Victor's voice was calm, too calm. Keanu took a step forward, placing himself between Victor and the women. "You know exactly what I'm doing," Keanu said evenly. Victor's smile was chilling. "You think you can just walk out of here with my family?" He sneered. "That's not how this works, Reeves." Sophie let out a choked sob. Barbara took a trembling step forward. "Let go of our daughter, Victor," she said. For the first time, her voice was steel. Victor laughed. "You've spent too much time watching his movies," he mocked. "This isn't some heroic rescue. Sweetheart, you're nothing without me." Keanu's jaw tightened. He could see Victor's grip tightening on Sophie's arm, the way she winced but tried not to cry out. And that's when Keanu made his choice. Enough. With a swift, calculated motion, Keanu moved. 1 second, Victor was gloating. The next, he was on the ground, his wrist twisted in Keanu's iron grip, his security guards caught off guard. Sophie stumbled back into Barbara's arms. Victor grunted in pain, his eyes blazing with rage and panic. Keanu leaned down, his voice deadly quiet. "You're done." And then, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The fall of a tyrant. The distant wail of sirens cut through the night air, creeping closer with each passing second. The sound should have been a warning, a sign that the authorities were on their way, that the night's twisted masquerade was about to come crashing down. But Victor Langham wasn't listening. He was on the floor, his wrist twisted painfully in Keanu Reeves' iron grip, yet his eyes blazed with undiluted rage. His security guards stood frozen, hesitant, their loyalties suddenly uncertain as their employer lay subdued at the hands of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled violence in front of millions. Keanu wasn't acting now. This was real. Victor sputtered through clenched teeth, his free hand clawing at Keanu's sleeve. "You think this is over?" he seethed. "You think?" Keanu applied just enough pressure to his wrist to make him shut up. "I think," Keanu said, his voice low, dangerous, "you should let go of your delusions. Because this is over." Victor gasped, his body jerking involuntarily at the slight increase in pain. Keanu didn't break his wrist, though for a moment he considered it. Then he shoved Victor's arm away, stepping back just as Barbara and Sophie moved behind him. Elena Morrow, who had stood still until now, watching carefully, moved swiftly, positioning herself near the hotel's emergency stairwell. She gave Keanu a single nod. The police were here. It was time to move. The power of fear. Keanu turned his gaze to the two private security guards, whose earlier confidence had vanished. Their hands hovered near their belts, likely where their radios were clipped, but neither had drawn a weapon. They weren't paid enough for this kind of mess. "Are you going to make a choice?" Keanu asked them, his voice even. "Or are you going to let him take you down with him?" The two men hesitated. Victor snarled from the floor, glaring at his own guards like a cornered wolf. "You work for me," he snapped. "Do your damn jobs." But the guards didn't move. Keanu saw it, the shift in their expressions, the subtle change in posture. They had already lost faith in Victor Langham. Because for all his money and power, for all the charm and control he exerted, there was one thing he couldn't escape: the consequences of fear. And right now, they were afraid of Keanu Reeves. More importantly, they were afraid of what would happen if they stood against him. The tension cracked. One of the guards spoke first. "We didn't sign up for this." His voice was low, uneasy. "We weren't told about." He gestured vaguely toward Sophie, his gaze flickering to the bruises on her arms. The second guard, who had been shifting uncomfortably the whole time, finally took a step back. That was all Keanu needed. He grabbed Barbara's hand, motioning to Elena and Sophie. "We're leaving." Victor shouted something, But Keanu ignored him. Barbara hesitated, looking back at her husband for the briefest of moments. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was years of conditioned fear telling her she wasn't allowed to walk away. Keanu saw it, the way her fingers trembled in his grip. But then, Sophie clutched her mother's hand, and Barbara chose freedom. Together, they ran, a house of cards collapsing. By the time they reached the hotel lobby, the scene had transformed into a media frenzy. Dozens of cameras were outside the grand glass doors, their flashes relentless, their voices anxious and hungry. Security guards were scattered, some scrambling to contain the growing chaos, others speaking urgently into radios. And at the center of it all, Los Angeles PD. 5 officers were moving toward the elevator, no doubt on their way to arrest Victor, while another team was securing the exits. And then, Detective Luis Salgado stepped into the lobby. Keanu knew exactly who he was. A seasoned investigator, Salgado had built his reputation on taking down high-profile predators. His presence alone sent a clear message. This was no longer a private matter. This was a full-blown criminal investigation. The moment Salgado's sharp eyes landed on Keanu, Barbara, and Sophie, he moved. "Mr. Reeves." His voice was calm but firm. "Are you going to tell me what the hell is going on?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I have a minor with visible injuries and a woman who has been held against her will," Keanu said. "And the man responsible? He's upstairs." Salgado's expression hardened instantly. His gaze flickered towards Sophie, who was still clutching Barbara's hand, her body half hidden behind Keanu. When she turned her face slightly, the bruises along her arms became visible in the hotel's bright lighting. Salgado's jaw tightened. He turned toward his officers. "Get Child Protective Services here immediately," he ordered. Then, to another officer, "Tell the team upstairs. Langham is a priority arrest. Cuff him and bring him down." Everything snapped into motion. Officers moved. Phones rang. Security scrambled. And outside, the paparazzi had figured out that something big was happening. Keanu could see it, their excitement, the way they were shouting into their microphones, speaking urgently into cameras. The story was breaking. Victor Langham, Hollywood's golden event planner, was about to be exposed as an abuser in front of millions of people, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truth comes out. Barbara hadn't spoken much since they left the upper floor. But now she turned to Salgado. "I want to file charges," she said, her voice stronger than before. "For me. For my daughter." Salgado nodded. "You will, and we will protect you." Sophie, who had been silent, suddenly tugged at her mother's sleeve. Barbara turned to her. Sophie hesitated, then whispered, "Are we free now?" Barbara's face crumbled. She dropped to her knees, pulling Sophie into her arms, sobbing softly into her daughter's shoulder. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. He knelt beside them, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's back. "You're free," he said, "and no one is ever going to hurt you again." Sophie buried her face against her mother, holding on as if she never wanted to let go. Barbara looked up at Keanu, her eyes full of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "Just never go back." Barbara nodded, holding Sophie even closer. And for the first time in years, they were finally safe. As police escorted Victor Langham out in handcuffs, as the press erupted in a media storm, as the world finally saw the truth behind the man's carefully crafted image, Keanu Reeves simply stood back and watched. Because tonight, he wasn't a movie hero. Tonight, he was a real one. The collapse of a kingpin. The arrest. The gold-trimmed glass doors of the Starlight Grand Hotel swung open violently as Victor Langham was dragged out by 2 officers. Even in handcuffs, he thrashed, his face contorted with fury and disbelief. "This is a mistake," Victor bellowed, struggling against the iron grip of the law. "You can't do this. I know people. You're all making a damn mistake." The paparazzi erupted like a pack of starving wolves. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, their blinding lights capturing every second of Victor's downfall. Reporters shouted over one another, trying to seize the first exclusive. "Mr. Langham, do you deny the allegations? Did you abuse your wife and daughter? Is it true you were keeping your wife hostage? What do you say about the bruises on your daughter?" Victor's eyes were wild, darting around as if searching for an escape. He had built an empire on manipulation, power, and lies. And yet, for the first time in his life, he was powerless. Detective Luis Salgado stood firm beside him, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Victor Langham, you are under arrest for domestic abuse, false imprisonment, and endangering the welfare of a minor. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." But Victor wasn't listening. Instead, his eyes locked onto Barbara and Sophie, standing by the hotel entrance, protected by Keanu and Alina. And in that moment, Victor's rage transformed into something even darker, pure hatred. "Barbara," he screamed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You ungrateful." Keanu moved instantly, positioning himself directly between Victor and the two people he had terrorized for years. Victor snarled, his expression twisting into something almost inhuman. "You think you've won." He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "This is temporary. I'll be out by tomorrow, and when I am." Keanu took a single step forward, his voice low and deadly calm. "No," he said, "you won't." Something in Victor's expression flickered. For the first time, there was uncertainty. Keanu's gaze was unshakable. He had spent years perfecting the portrayal of dangerous men in films, but in this moment, he wasn't acting. He was dead serious. "You'll never get near them again," Keanu continued. "Not now. Not ever." Victor's mouth opened, perhaps to throw another threat, to sputter another desperate lie. But before he could speak, an officer shoved him toward the awaiting black and white police cruiser. The metal door slammed shut behind him. For the first time in his carefully controlled, meticulously curated life, Victor Langham was completely and utterly alone. And there was nothing he could do about it. Sophie's first breath of freedom. The moment the police car disappeared down the road, the night felt different, lighter, as if the weight of years of terror and silence had finally begun to lift. Barbara let out a long breath, her hands still tightly gripping Sophie's shoulders. But this time, it wasn't to keep her daughter from running. It was to keep herself from falling apart. Sophie clung to her mother's dress, her tiny fingers shaking. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of fear, and now, with Victor truly gone, she didn't know what to do next. Keanu crouched down beside her, keeping his voice gentle, patient. "You're safe now, Sophie," he said. Sophie lifted her gaze, her tear-filled, exhausted eyes searching his face. And then, for the first time that night, she smiled. It was small, tentative, a single ray of light after years of darkness. Barbara broke down, pulling her daughter into her arms, her body shaking from the sheer relief of finally being free. Alina placed a hand on Barbara's shoulder, her own eyes shimmering. "We're going to make sure you both get the help you need," Alina assured her. "There are shelters, legal teams, protection services, whatever you need, we'll fight for it." Barbara nodded weakly, grateful but overwhelmed. Keanu, still kneeling at Sophie's level, watched the young girl closely. She wasn't trembling anymore. Instead, she took one deep breath, as if she were truly breathing for the first time. Keanu smiled. "You're pretty tough, you know that," he said. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "You're pretty cool," she mumbled back. Keanu chuckled softly. "You too." It wasn't over, not completely. There would be court hearings, public scrutiny, healing that would take time. But at least now, Sophie and Barbara had a chance. And that was enough. For tonight. For now. The story that would change everything. The hotel exploded with media activity. Reporters were broadcasting live, News stations were breaking the scandal. Social media was erupting with the footage of Victor's arrest. Elena Morrow turned to Keanu, pulling out her notebook and recorder. "This is it," she murmured. "This is going to change everything." Keanu nodded. And then, as he looked around, the flashing lights, the roaring headlines, the rush of truth finally breaking free, he felt something deeper settle within him. Not all heroes wore capes. Some just refused to look away when someone needed help. Tonight, a monster fell, and Keanu Reeves made sure he would never rise again. After the storm, a new dawn. The Starlight Grand Hotel had transformed from a stage of luxury and spectacle to the epicenter of a scandal. News vans lined the street, their bright floodlights illuminating the hotel entrance as journalists reported the shocking downfall of Victor Langham. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The once glamorous ballroom, where Hollywood's elite had mingled, was now nearly empty, the guests having made a hasty retreat the moment police arrived. The air that once carried the scent of expensive champagne and whispered deals was now heavy with the weight of reality. But for Barbara Langham and her daughter, Sophie, the night wasn't about headlines or public disgrace. It was about survival. And starting over. The aftermath. Truth versus image. Keanu Reeves sat in a quiet conference room on the second floor of the hotel, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Across from him, Detective Luis Salgado and Elena Morrow were discussing the logistics of the case, while Barbara sat beside them, exhaustion etched into her features. Sophie was curled up in a plush armchair beside her mother, clutching a blanket an officer had given her. She looked small, fragile, but for the first time, she wasn't scared. Elena flipped open her notebook, adjusting the voice recorder on the table. "All right," she said. "We need to go over this carefully. The press is going to tear this apart, and Victor is going to do everything he can to spin the story in his favor." Barbara swallowed hard. "He always does," she murmured. Salgado leaned forward. "That's why we're getting ahead of it." His voice was steady, assured. "We've already contacted Child Protective Services. Sophie is being placed under your custody, and we're working to secure a restraining order against Victor." Barbara's shoulders sagged in relief, but Keanu could see the lingering fear in her eyes. Elena jotted down notes. "The world is going to ask, why now? Why didn't you leave sooner? Why did you stay?" Barbara flinched at the question, but Keanu spoke before she could. "Because it's never that simple," he said. Elena met his gaze. "I know," she admitted, "but the court of public opinion is ruthless. If we don't shape the truth before Victor's PR team does, he'll play the victim and turn this around." Barbara took a shaky breath. "I stayed because I didn't know I could leave," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because he made me believe that if I ran, he'd find me, that he'd take Sophie away." Keanu's jaw tightened. "He won't," he said firmly. Barbara glanced at Sophie, who had fallen asleep, her breathing finally steady and peaceful. "I want to fight," Barbara said softly. "I want the world to know what he did to us." Elena's pen stilled against the paper. "This is going to get ugly," she warned. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Barbara looked at Sophie again. Then she straightened her shoulders. "I have to be. The battle begins." By morning, the scandal had spread like wildfire. Every major news outlet carried the footage. Victor Langham's arrest, the bruises on Sophie's arms, Keanu Reeves stepping in to protect them. Social media exploded. Keanu Reeves is a real-life hero. What an absolute legend. How did Victor Langham hide this for so long? The Hollywood elite protects their own. Disgusting. I hope Sophie and Barbara get justice. No child should have to live in fear. Victor's PR team scrambled to control the narrative, releasing a carefully worded statement claiming that the situation was a deep family misunderstanding. But it backfired instantly. A former housekeeper came forward, detailing years of abuse and silence within the Langham household. More staff members followed, revealing how Barbara had been isolated from friends, how Sophie was always covered in long sleeves, even in summer. The image of Victor Langum, the successful philanthropist, the family man, the golden host of Hollywood's elite. It crumbled overnight. A moment of solace. 2 days after the gala, Keanu sat on the porch of a safe house, a cup of tea in his hands, watching the morning mist rise over the hills. Barbara and Sophie were inside, protected under police surveillance until the trial began. Elena had taken on the role of media strategist, making sure their story was told truthfully. And Keanu. He had spent the past 48 hours deflecting interview requests, dodging Hollywood executives trying to spin this into a PR stunt, and ignoring offers for TV specials about his heroism. None of that mattered. All that mattered was that Sophie was safe. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her small hands gripping the edge of her oversized sweater. "Hey, kid," he said, setting down his tea. "Couldn't sleep." Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. "I had a nightmare." Keanu nodded. "Want to talk about it?" She bit her lip. "It's dumb." "Doubt it." Sophie shuffled forward, climbing onto the bench beside him. "I dreamt that Dad got out, and he found us, and we had to go back." Keanu exhaled, then leaned back slightly, tilting his face toward the sky. "You're not going back," he said. "Ever." Sophie looked up at him. "You promise?" Keanu turned to face her fully. "I promise." Sophie studied his face for a long moment. Then, for the first time since that night at the gala, she relaxed. "Thanks for being the good guy," she mumbled, hugging her knees to her chest. Keanu chuckled softly. "Thanks for being brave." Sophie hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her sweater, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. "I made this for you," she said shyly, handing it to him. Keanu unfolded it carefully. It was a child's drawing, a simple sketch in colored pencil. It showed a tall figure with black hair and a long coat, standing in front of a smaller figure, a girl in a denim jacket. Above them, in large, uneven letters, was written, "Thank you for saving me." Keanu's chest tightened. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. "This is the best thing I've ever gotten." Sophie gave him a small, genuine smile. For the first time, she believed she was safe. And for Keanu Reeves, that was all that mattered. The final chapter, justice and new beginnings. The world had changed overnight for Barbara Langum and Sophie. The fear that once shrouded their lives had been ripped away, leaving behind a raw and uncertain freedom. But with that freedom came a storm of media frenzy, legal battles, and deep emotional wounds that would take time to heal. Yet, amidst it all, they had Keanu Reeves, not as a celebrity, not as an action star, but as the man who had refused to turn his back when no one else dared to stand up for them. Now, the real battle began. The trial that shook Hollywood. The Superior Court of Los Angeles was swarmed with reporters as the case against Victor Langum officially began. Every news outlet in the country covered the trial, branding it as Hollywood's darkest scandal. Barbara Langum was the star witness, testifying in painstaking detail about the years of control, abuse, and psychological torment she endured. The courtroom was silent as she described how Victor isolated her, manipulated their public image, and terrorized their daughter behind closed doors. Sophie, too young to testify in the courtroom, gave her statement through a child psychologist, recounting in her small, trembling voice how her father's hands weren't just for discipline. They were for punishment, control, and fear. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos of bruises, statements from former household staff, medical records, and then the final blow. Elena Moreau's exclusive interview with Victor's former personal assistant was aired, revealing years of hush money payments, buried allegations, and threats made against anyone who dared to expose him. Victor's lawyers fought hard, trying to paint Barbara as an unstable woman, a gold digger, a liar. They claimed Sophie's bruises were from roughhousing, that Barbara was exaggerating, that Victor was a victim of cancel culture and false accusations. But the jury saw through the lies. And so did the public. The moment of reckoning came on the final day of the trial. As the jury filed in, the tension in the room was palpable. Barbara sat with her hands clenched, Sophie beside her, gripping her fingers tightly. Keanu sat just a few rows behind them, watching with quiet, unwavering support. The foreman stood. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. On the charge of domestic abuse, guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, guilty. On all charges, guilty. A collective breath was released in the courtroom. Victor Langham, Hollywood's most powerful event organizer, was sentenced to 35 years in prison without parole. He wouldn't hurt Barbara or Sophie again. It was over. Barbara broke down in tears, her entire body shaking. Years of fear, pain, and captivity finally gone. Keanu watched as Sophie clutched her mother, burying her face in Barbara's shoulder, whispering the words she had been too afraid to believe for so long. "We're free. A new life." 3 months had passed since Victor Langham had been sentenced. Barbara and Sophie had moved away from Los Angeles, leaving behind the shadows of their past. They now lived in a quiet coastal town in Northern California, far from the flashbulbs of Hollywood and the ghosts of the past. The house was small but warm, a place where Sophie could finally be a kid without fear of a knock at the door. And Keanu. He hadn't disappeared. He had made a silent promise that night at the gala, that he would always be there if they needed him. So, once every few weeks he visited. Not as Keanu Reeves, the global superstar, but as Keanu Reeves, their friend. A visit unlike any other. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Keanu pulled up to the small house. Sophie was waiting for him on the porch, her face lighting up the moment he stepped out of his car. "You're late," she teased. Keanu smirked. Blame lay traffic. She giggled, running up to him with open arms. Keanu scooped her up, spinning her around before setting her down. "How's life, kid?" he asked. Sophie grinned. "I have a dog now." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah." Barbara stepped onto the porch, smiling as a golden retriever puppy bounded toward them, barking excitedly. Keanu laughed, kneeling down as the puppy licked his face enthusiastically. "Guess you don't need me to protect you anymore," he joked. Sophie beamed. "We named him Neo." Keanu's heart swelled. He glanced at Barbara, who simply smiled knowingly. Sophie tugged on his sleeve. "Come inside. We made cookies." Keanu let himself be led inside, feeling something he hadn't expected. A sense of home. Epilogue. The true meaning of heroism. That night, after a homemade dinner and a long evening of laughter, Keanu sat on the back porch with Barbara as Sophie played with Neo in the yard. The stars stretched endlessly above them, twinkling against the velvet night sky. Barbara sighed, watching her daughter. "She laughs so much now," she murmured. Keanu nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "She's free." Barbara turned to him. "You know, you saved us that night." Keanu shook his head. "No," he said. "You saved yourselves. I was just there when you needed someone to remind you that you could." Barbara's eyes shimmered with gratitude and something deeper. "You're a good man, Keanu." Keanu chuckled. "I just do what I can." Silence fell between them, comfortable and full of understanding. Sophie suddenly ran up to them, panting from chasing Neo. "Keanu," she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, kid. Do you ever get scared?" Keanu thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he admitted. "A lot of times." Sophie blinked. "But you always look so brave." Keanu smiled. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," he said. "It just means doing the right thing anyway." Sophie considered his words. Then she grinned. "Then I think I'm really brave too." Keanu's heart swelled. "You are," he said softly. Sophie beamed. Then she darted off, laughing as Neo chased her in circles. Barbara exhaled, watching her daughter. She's finally happy. Keanu glanced at her. Yeah, he said. She is. And for the first time in years, so was Barbara. And maybe, just maybe, Keanu Reeves was too.